So this is lecture 6 in the Western Peace Traditions. I touched on, in lecture 5, the prologue to the Beatitudes, and as I mentioned in that particular reflection, is the Beatitudes are in many ways the Magna Carta of peacemaking for significant elements of the Western tradition. It has shaped the whole elements of the Christian peacemaking tradition. It had an impact on Mahatma Gandhi, who drew much of his thinking from Lev Tolstoy. Both Tolstoy and Gandhi were very much shaped by the Beatitudes. We live in an area here in the Fraser Valley, a historic Anabaptist Mennonite tradition. One wing of them draws from the Beatitudes, their peace tradition. The Doukhobors of British Columbia were very much shaped by Lev Tolstoy's work, and particularly Tolstoy's work on Beatitudes, the kingdom of heaven, pacifist. Tolstoy's third novel, Resurrection, all the royalties of that brought the Doukhobors initially to Saskatchewan, but more importantly to British Columbia. And so the Beatitudes and the Sermon on the Mount are foundational, not just for peacemaking, but for Jesus, for the formation of the authentic life. So what does it mean to live a genuine, authentic life in terms of the formation of character itself? Because the question often is, for anyone attempting to live their life in a minimally meaningful manner, what are the decisions that need to be made that lead to a life of integrity? And what are the conditions that exist internally and externally that lead to not only personally, but family and friendships and community and nation, to a genuine life? And just as everything has a structure, and its consequence is freedom, so what Jesus is articulating in the Beatitudes, these are the conditions, not only for peacemaking, but these are the conditions, if understood properly, for an authentic life throughout time. So we do know in all other spheres of life that conditions exist to achieve certain ends. If you want to be on the highway, drive a car, you have to know how to put a key in ignition. The car has to be in good shape. You have to stay on the right side of the road. You don't drink loads of bottles of beer for people to be safe on the road. There are conditions that exist that people have to internalize to be free to drive a road. If a person wants to be a dentist and practice meaningfully, not only does that man or woman have to take training to be a dentist, but they have to know how to run a business, and they have to know how to hire people, and they have to pay people. So to be a dentist, there are a variety of conditions that exist for that profession to be lived. So just as in the world of driving, just in the world as a professional skill, not only the training, but then the working out of that in day-to-day life, so in terms of the shaping of human identity in a meaningful way, the Beatitudes are an attempt to say, this is the structure, this is the framework within which, if a person internalizes and lives out in a meaningful way, they will understand the meaning of freedom. So I want to touch on the first 3 in this part 2 of the Beatitudes, which are more internal. And then in part 3 of my lecture of Beatitudes, I'm going to look at the external outworking that in terms of peacemaking and justice seeking, and what Jesus would see as an authentic prophetic vocation as well. So when we come to the first of the Beatitudes, as I mentioned last week, Jesus has taken the disciples up on a hill, and he is very clear that this is the teaching is for a few. These people are minimally prepared to hear what he's about to say, and he makes a distinction between the crowds, which are not ready to hear, and the few who there is a longing, there is an openness, there is a desire to actually grow deeper, to ask questions about meaningful lifestyle and a meaningful sense of identity and how a person's to live their life. And so Jesus, always in that classical sense, for he came from a classical Mediterranean civilization, He always understood the relationship between accommodating people where they are and also the process of reservation. There's certain things you reserve saying, you don't say to people, because once you're around them long enough, you know the desire is not there to go deeper, to think more meaningfully, to live more substantively. And so you just accommodate them where they are. And hopefully on the journey there will increasingly, as a variety of experiences, there will be a hunger, a longing to grow beyond the level of shallowness and silliness and being perpetually distracted by silly things that really don't matter. But if a person is there, then you have to essentially just reserve things because they're not going to hear. It'll bounce off them like water off a brick wall. And you accommodate where they are while hopefully step by step massaging them into thinking and living at a deeper level over a period of time. But at this point in the Beatitudes, Jesus is articulating the conditions for a genuine human life, and a part of that obviously is peacemaking and peacekeeping. And so what are the conditions that exist to that? So the first of the Beatitudes, he says, it's makarioi, which is interesting, it's a word in Greek which means godlike status, makar. And he says, the godlike tendencies you will have if you're absolutely, and this is an interesting word in Greek, if you're absolutely destitute of spirit. Now, the opposite of that is those who are so full of themselves they're incapable of hearing not only themselves, but they're incapable of hearing others. And what Jesus is saying, until a person is willing to let go of their arrogance, their drivenness, their misperceptions of themselves, their socialization, their conditioning, their fragile identity, until they're willing to become absolutely destitute of spirit, they're not going to go very far. And of course the flip side of that is, the person who's so self-contained, so arrogant, so full of themselves, appetites so swollen, they don't think of others, they don't hear others, they're not attentive to others. Jesus essentially says, the divine-like status of those who are willing to let go of the agenda of their identity. There's two Greek words for poverty. One is moderate poverty, in which you're still tending your own identity. It looks like there's a level of humility, but there's still a sense of protectiveness, a sense of defining oneself, in which a refusal to let go of elements within oneself. But Jesus is saying, the other word Greek here is, no, just let go of everything. There's a lovely Zen parable here that fills this out nicely. You have this scholar, this Zen scholar who knows everything of knowledge about Zen. He goes to a Zen Roshi, and they get talking, and the Zen Roshi does what they do. They boil the water, which is very interesting. The metaphor, you boil the impurities out of the self, and then the cup of the soul is whisked in that sense. And so the Roshi gives the Zen scholar this cup, so the impurities from one side have been sanitized through boiled water. The cup is whisked, so very much two metaphors here. And he gives the scholar the cup, puts it on his, and then he begins to pour the boiling water into the cup, but the water spills over the cup, and the Zen scholar jumps up and he says, "What are you doing? You're pouring this boiling water all over me." And the Roshi says, "And yes, you're so full of yourself in terms of your knowledge and your information about Buddhism and Zen, you're not in a position to understand, and I had to almost burn you to wake you up." In that sense, it was almost like a Zen cone in that sense. So what Jesus is getting at here, and so what the Zen Roshi was essentially getting is similar to what Jesus is, you got to empty yourself. There's got to be, and of course in all great philosophical religious traditions, the first step into enlightenment is death. It's letting go. It's not clinging, it's not attachment. It's not only attachment to things, but it's not attachment to the ego itself. And so the first of all steps in terms of self-understanding is letting go of the false self. And until that occurs, the phoenix-like resurrection, or in Jesus' case, the image and likeness of God, will not appear. In classical patristic thought, there's the notion they didn't use mirrors as we would today. They would polish metal, and the metal became a mirror. And so when the metal had dirt on it, it would not reflect back the light of the sun. And so there was this polishing of the dirt off needed so the metal would reflect not only the light of the sun, but one could see one's own reflection in it as well. So what Jesus is getting at here is that, the divine-like status of your new identity will emerge to the degree that a person lets go of a shallow understanding of the self, a desperate understanding of the self, an insecure understanding of the self. Just let it die. Let it go. Don't cling to it. Because it's a lot of work to cling to these sorts of things when it's much easier just to let go. As I said, the flip side of that, people are so defensive about themselves, so protective, so engaged in their wants, their inflated needs, defining themselves against others. And Jesus says, well, that's just going to lead to restlessness. It's going to lead to emptiness. It's going to lead to a frantic lifestyle, running hither, thither, and yon to feed this ravenous ego, which can never be filled. And as soon as a person gets what they want, then they want something else. And it's like a great cannibal within, or a serpent, which I'll come to a little later here, within. So Jesus says then, to the degree a person's willing to let go of that, it is they who will inherit the kingdom of heaven. Basilia to Urano. So in terms of living in community then, the person who is willing to let go of their own agenda, they're the ones who will be knit together well into that sense, a kingdom. A person who's only concerned with defending their own identity, often they're like broken glass when it comes to others. They do not know how to fit into community very well, and it's only the person who has a softness and knows how to let go. They don't defend either external things they cling to, or more substantively clinging to the ego or the false self, or Alan Watts called the skin-encapsulated ego. They let go. They are the ones who fit into community in a meaningful way. The second beatitude then is, the divine-like status of those who mourn. To the degree a person is engaged less in defining their own identity, and emptying themselves, they then are increasingly in a position not only to feel the own pain of their own death and resurrection, but also they begin to have affinities with others in their struggles. Plato once said, "Be kind to others, for all are in the midst of a battle." And the second beatitude, the more a person lets go of their egoistic need to be in control, to think of themselves, for the world to shrink to their own little world, that letting go then opens people up to feel others in their struggles. They can be there for others in their struggles. They feel an affinity. They have antenna to be there for others in their struggles. They're not isolated from others. And so you get the second beatitude, the emptying that goes on of the ego. Now the filling begins to occur, or the emergence of the new being, or the new divine being. The makar, in that sense, begins to emerge as a person who is sensitive to the needs, the struggles, the agon of others in that sense. Now, of course, the flip side of that is a person who's egocentric, who really often either manipulates others to serve their interests, or they ignore others who don't serve their interests. The person, what Jesus is talking about, meaningful relationships of letting go, a person then is now filled with a spirit of empathy and compassion. And Jesus says in this second, the divine-like status of those who mourn. Now the danger when a person sometimes enters the suffering, the tragedies, the struggles of life, they become paralyzed by the sadnesses, the tragedies, the struggles, and what Jesus is saying, okay, for those of you who enter into this, versus avoiding suffering and tragedy, the paraclete, the comforter will come. And so those who have the courage, in that sense, to enter the painful areas of life, rather than ignoring, avoiding, sheltering oneself in gated communities, there will be comfort in the midst of that. There will be a sense of centering, a sense of stillness, so that there will be an ability to maintain oneself through that as the cup of our new being begins to emerge. And the third beatitude then is, oh, the divine-like status of those. It's oftentimes translated as blessed are the meek. And then meek sometimes is translated, sadly so, as a doormat, or allow people to walk over you. Meekness in the Greek sense here, it's an interesting word. It's praes, which means immense strength under control for goodness. And so as a person begins to awaken to their new being and feels empathy with others, Jesus argued there's going to be increasingly a sense of focus, a sense of strength, a sense of movement towards important issues. But strength without goodness can lead to domination. It can lead to power. It can lead to control. It can lead to hurting others. And so this third element, in which Jesus is then going to slowly move from the inner life of emptying, slowly being filled with sympathy and empathy with others. And now where does one begin to take that? Well, a new strength begins to emerge in terms of engagement. And he says, it's these people who are going to inherit the earth. People who use their emerging new being in a meaningful manner. They're the ones who are going to inherit the earth and create the new kingdom, which is the first beatitude. So the third beatitude matches the first. And so those are the people who will bring in the better world. And so we can see people who can be very egocentric, very driven, very passionate, very intense, but they are erratic in their desires. They're fragmented. They can hurt and harm people. Jesus is, in the third beatitude, is as a person is maturing, allow that strength to be focused, to be brought under control for goodness. And then the next beatitudes, of course, take a person in that particular direction. What is goodness in the external way? So the first three attitudes are really about the internal homework that has to be done. The next beatitudes take people into the external world of justice and peacemaking. Now, I'll just finish this brief lecture with the... We've been going through Pauline Johnson's Legends of Vancouver. It's quite a timely one. It's called The Sea Serpent, which actually fits in nicely with the Beatitudes. The sixth story in Pauline Johnson's Legends of Vancouver comes from the story of the gold rush days of the 19th century, when there was quite a discovery of gold in BC, Yukon, Alaska, and all the people coming up from California and others moving northward in the hope of becoming the Midas man and rich, quick, wealthy. And of course, most of them who came here did not know their way about British Columbia, Yukon. So what they did is they'd hire First Nations people to guide them on the trails that had been put in place for life. And so what the Sea Serpent is really the story of... So Pauline Johnson, the story told her by Chief Joe Capilano, is that most First Nations people are not driven by gold or wealth or the Midas touch. They think of potlatches, they think community, they think of sharing. But some of these First Nations guides, particularly one, so the story goes, was so taken as a guide by all of these Caucasians, people coming over and lusting for quick money, quick wealth, and some of them became very wealthy, is that he absorbed this particular lust for gold, for wealth, and then he would come back and not thinking with his newfound wealth of the poor in the band, single people, because as Pauline Johnson records the story through Joe Capilano, is that above all, bands were very concerned with community. They were concerned with sharing, that if people were in need, single people, poor people, where there were deaths, where there were poverty, people shared. But this particular First Nations person comes back. He begins to flaunt his wealth. He thinks he's more important than others, and he really becomes demonized in that sense by what they call the white man's greed or avarice, in which they're possessed by this need to have more and more things. And so the Great Spirit, of course, the band pleads with him to share of his wealth, what he has been given through being a guide and leading people up into the gold fields of British Columbia and Yukon and Alaska. He says, no, it's mine. I put the work in. I did the hard work. So you get the work ethic here. I did all the work. I put the labor in. You didn't. I went to places which were difficult. I had to deal with greedy men who only lusted for gold, and so I deserve it, and I don't have to share this with anyone. And so increasingly within the band, the medicine men, the leaders, the women, the men, they increasingly were not sure what to do, how to deal with this person who only thought of wealth, and really since had become a demon and at war with his own tribe. And so the Great Spirit turned him into a serpent, a massive serpent that coiled around the Narrows in British Columbia, and his head was at Brockton Point. And so this person was transformed into a massive serpent. And so what in fact he actually had become as a person now was transformed into literally a dragon. Of course, you get this notion of the dragon in many other cultures. You get in Lord of the Rings, Smaug sits on his gold. You get Thor and Oakenshield, the dwarves, the gold, and what they become possessed by the very thing they want to possess, and so they think they're free. You get in the Nibelungen Lied, Siegfried kills the dragon, but he himself becomes, in a sense, the dragon. And so the Sea Serpent story is very much about the serpent that can get within us. In that sense, it fits in nicely with the Beatitudes, as people who think they're using their freedom to possess something become possessed by the very thing they think they're possessing, and they turn into a serpent in that sense. So one of the young men in the band said, listen, because the serpent had essentially now was filling out all the Narrows through Stanley Park up into Brockton, had to be killed in that sense. But he was told, you can't just go and cut off. It had two heads. The one head, the serpent, devoured its own heart, and on the other hand it was devouring other people. And this young warrior, he was warned that just don't cut off its head, just like the Hydra myth in that sense. Don't cut off. You have to go right to the Hydra's, or the sea serpent's heart. And he said, I'll do this in 4 days, but he had to be clean, so he would often swim in the straits to clean himself. He had to be a pure person if he was going to kill evil in that sense. We're back to the Beatitudes here in one sense. If a person's going to deal with evil, they shouldn't become evil in the process. And if they themselves become imprisoned by their lusts, and they think they're free, they're in fact they themselves are imprisoned by their very longings, and they think they're free. And so this young warrior, he tells his mother, I'll be back in 4 days, but the actual task of killing the serpent takes months and months. So obviously a parable, if one is going to face the serpent within oneself, it just doesn't happen because desires, well, I'm going to go kill that element within myself or the other that is living that way. So the young warrior, over a period of time, again and again, swims in the Narrows, swims in the channels around Stanley Park, has to be clean constantly if he's going to battle, because if he's not clean, the very serpent, he'll become the serpent that he's trying to kill in the process. And so the sea serpent, and finally, eventually, he finds the heart of the sea serpent, and he moves in, and finally he gets to the very heart of the serpent. So rather than cutting off the heads, he has to kill the heart itself, which creates the serpent. And so the sea serpent story, which in Legends of Vancouver actually fits very, very nicely into the first three Beatitudes, is that when a person, in using their freedom, and attaching themselves to things that make them unfree, they become beasts. They become serpents. And in this First Nations story, what Jesus is getting at, obviously you have to die to those sort of lusts, those swollen appetites, those longings that move a person in a direction. Not only makes them restless, they're not fulfilled in even achieving their goal, but they become, in a sense, serpents. They become dragons in reality. They cease to be human. And in the particular story, the Sea Serpent, the young chief has to be clean if he's going to kill that serpent and free the tribe, and actually free the young person in the tribe itself who is taken in by this lust for gold. It's the Midas touch the Greeks worried about as well. Be careful if you want gold, because the very gold you may be longing for, you may become entombed by it and thinking you're free, and in fact you're a prisoner. In this case, turned into a serpent. In other Greek mythic stories, obviously, as I mentioned, within Lord of the Rings or within the Nibelungenlied, it's the same story of be wary of what you long for, because in the process of thinking you're using your freedom, you may be creating a prison in which you're shrinking more and more as a human being and becoming a serpent. So Beatitudes, the first three Beatitudes, and this First Nations story recounted by Joe Capilano to Pauline Johnson, they fit in very, very nicely. One obviously giving you a metaphor of a person who goes the opposite direction of what Jesus is trying to say in terms of living a meaningful, authentic, and a genuine life.